Thank you, Curtis. Can you hear me back there? Okay. Voting is the foundation of our democracy. Voting should be free and fair and accessible for all Americans. So we want to welcome our panelists today. All of these people here have been working to preserve and expand the rights to vote for every eligible citizen. We have Micah, Kubic, and as he just told me, please don't confuse that with Kubic. Micah has joined the ACLU of Kansas as its executive director in January 2015, and he has more than 15 years of experience in civil liberties, civil rights, and racial justice work. And the work that the ACLU is doing right now, and specifically as to Chris Kubic, could not be more timely and more helpful. And so we're very indebted and honored to have Dr. And next we have Mr. Mark Johnson. Professor Johnson also teaches at both the law school and at KU. He is a lawyer who practices and concentrates in the areas of communications, First Amendment, and employment relations. He teaches about elections and campaign finance and the First Amendment, and we are so honored and privileged to have someone who knows the law in this area in such a depth. Thank you very much, Professor Johnson. And then we have our own local and hopefully getting more national attention hero, Jamie Shew. So if I was asked, who would you point to as someone who knows how to run an office and who knows how to run an election and can make sure that people vote, I would show you poster child for voting rights, Jamie. I think this particular seminar could not be more timely, right? With the Election Integrity Commission just appointed. So I thought I would just tee up a quick question to you, Dr. Kubic, and ask you, could you tell us what happened, if you're, and this is just breaking news, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but the Star report this morning that Chris Kubic did in fact turn over the documents in only pursuant to federal court order, mind you, but he didn't just give the documents over. Instead, he stamped them with the big confidential, which was not part of the court's order. So what is the ACLU going to do next? And I'll ask you, what is the ACLU doing not only as to that particular lawsuit in Kansas, but what is the national thrust right now as to voting rights?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. My name is Micah Kubic. I'm very happy to be here with you this morning. Before I say anything else, I do have to give this sort of mandatory disclaimer, which is that we at the ACLU are a non-partisan, non-political organization. My presence here this morning does not connote an endorsement in any way. I'm here for informational and educational purposes. I will speak to any party that invites me. The Republicans just never seem to. So what happened yesterday was that some of you will recall back in the transition period, Secretary Kubic went and visited with President Trump, then President-elect Trump, at one of his golf courses and held this piece of paper in front of him that was captured on camera that mentioned a few things. It mentioned some proposals around some unconstitutional banning of Muslims from the United States. It mentioned some unconstitutional proposals around reducing immigration. And of course it mentioned something about the National Voter Registration Act, which is the crux of the 4 separate lawsuits that we have against Secretary Kubic right now. We thought that information would be very relevant to the case, because if he's arguing that the National Voter Registration Act should be amended in some way in order to make the lawsuit go away, that suggests that our interpretation of the law, which has so far been upheld by every single court it's been in, is in fact correct, and that Secretary Kubic is not, in fact, correct in his argument. That would not be a new thing for him, I might add, right? So just about anything he takes to court winds up not going so well for him. It goes well for our constitutional rights and the people of this state, but not so well for Secretary Kubic. He fought this and fought this and fought this and created all sorts of very creative arguments about executive privilege and national security to justify not turning over the documents. And eventually the magistrate judge said that he had to turn them over. He appealed that, of course, to the federal judge, Judge Julie Robinson, a judge who was appointed by George W. Bush, I hasten to add. And that judge as well told him that he had to turn it over by yesterday. We waited through the day, waited through the day, waited through the day, expecting it to come, expecting it to come. I said it would come at 4:59 Hawaii time. It eventually did come at 4:59 Central Time instead, so good for that. But of course it was marked confidential, which was not part of the agreement, because we think that the taxpayers of this state and the citizens of this state have the right to know what sort of changes he envisions to the voting rights laws of this state and this country. And so we were eager to make folks aware of the changes that he's proposing. But he stamped it confidential. So we have to go back to the judge again. We get to argue some more about this, which the cynic in me would suggest is probably his plan all along, to drag it out as long as possible, to stretch it out as long as possible. And that's, of course, what he's going to do with the litigation as well. We feel very optimistic that in the end we will prevail in all of these voting rights lawsuits, but of course he will then appeal it to the Circuit Court and the Supreme Court. And I always say he'll appeal it to the Intergalactic Court and the Universal Court, and he'll just continue to appeal and appeal and appeal to stretch it out as long as possible. We, on the other hand, are going to continue to fight as long as we need to and as hard as we need to in order to make sure that the constitutional right to vote is guaranteed as soon as possible for every citizen in this country. Because, of course, the right to vote is protected by the Constitution, not just in the one amendment that you got quizzed on, right, but 4 separate times. More than the right to free speech or the right to bear arms, the phrase the right to vote is included in the Constitution multiple times. And so that means that we have to defend it that much more strongly, especially against onslaughts from Secretary Kubic and this new commission that was created earlier this week. So we'll be fighting about that. That's the answer to that question. We have lawsuits going in multiple states. Kansas is on the front lines of this battle. So although you've heard a lot about Texas and North Carolina and Wisconsin, and we are involved at the ACLU in all of those pieces of litigation, they're all bad, they're all terrible. The law in Kansas is worse. And so Kansas is really the focal point of the national ACLU's battle for voting rights right now as well. So we'll be fighting that litigation. We'll be working on legislation in Congress to restore pieces of the Voting Rights Act that were stripped away, undermined by a Supreme Court ruling a few years ago. And then we'll continue to do work as this commission develops whatever report it produces as well. I am not terribly optimistic that we will agree with the findings of that commission. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. There are some common methods of legislation to restrict voting rights and voting access. One of them, of course, is Kubic's infamous voter ID laws that we're familiar with here in Kansas. And another prong that the people that Kubic represents are trying to pass across the country are these voter registration laws. And so I thought that perhaps I would ask Mr. Johnson if he could bring us up to date and maybe discuss those laws just a bit and where we are nationally as to that.
Sure. I guess I'll follow Micah's example and stand. Now, as I pointed out when I arrived here, obviously I didn't get the dress code memo. But I do have an excuse. I've been to one KU graduation already, the journalism school, and in 2.5 hours I'll be at the law school graduation, so I thought I should dress appropriately. Now, the one thing you're being saved, because Micah is not dressed as he usually is, I've seen two guys wearing bow ties. Now, the difference, however, is that I wear nice, neat, what we call batwing bow ties. He wears these big honking wide. Go big, yeah, go big or go home. But, Marcy, thank you so much, and thank you to your organization for inviting me to speak. I also happen to be involved in the litigation that Micah was addressing. I'm the lead counsel in a companion case, and so one of the first things I asked him this morning when we arrived here, because of the fact that these documents were marked confidential, I was hoping they would be able to share them with me the moment they arrived. My guess is going to be it's a matter of probably the middle of next week when the judge says, take that stupid stamp off there, and then everybody will be able to see what these documents say. He kind of shared with me what they say. I think they're really good. But we'll find out. So the question was, what's going on with registration laws?
Voter registration laws, voter ID laws.
Yeah. Okay, there are two sort of separate topics there. Registration, which of course you have to do in order to vote. And then there's actually voting itself. That's exercising your right to vote, going to the polls or filling out an absentee ballot and exercising your franchise. Two separate issues. What's happened, to a great degree, started in the 90s, but really accelerated after 2010. Because if you remember, 2010 was President Obama's first midterm election, and it's what we in the electoral world call a wave election for Republicans. And many states, after that election, had what, again, we call a trifecta government. In other words, a Republican governor, a Republican Senate, state Senate, and a Republican House of Representatives, which in essence gave the Republicans, and I'm here as a nonpartisan, but it gave the Republicans in many states a free ride to adopt whatever kind of voter legislation that they wanted to. So these restrictive laws have largely been passed in the past, in the last 5 or 6 years. And several states are sort of the poster children for this. Kansas is one, which in 2011 the legislature passed and the governor signed a law called the SAFE Act, Secure and Fair Elections. North Carolina has done it, Texas has done it, Wisconsin has done it. So you see a number of states which totally flipped after the 2010 election, passed these restrictive laws. Okay. On the voter registration side, it's not just the right to register, for example, in Kansas, where you have to have proof of citizenship. And there are, at this point, 4 states that have that requirement. Kansas, of course, is one. And Kansas, by the way, is the only one that was actually enforcing it. Alabama, Georgia, Arizona also have had variations of that law, although none of those states has really attempted to enforce it. Only us proud Kansans have had to deal with it. But there are other ways that states, this particularly has happened in North Carolina, have tried to restrict registration. They've cut back on when people can register, how far in advance of the election can you register. They have made it more difficult to maintain sort of party registration. Some states actually have party registration. In Kansas, for example, and this is by a law that was passed a couple of years ago, between June the 1st, which happens to be the deadline when people have to file for the primaries, the August primary, between June the 1st and about a week or so after the primary takes place, if you're a registered voter, you can't change your party registration. Why do you think that is? For the simple reason that it prevents folks like you. In Lawrence, this is probably not an issue for you because Democrats actually have a chance of winning elections in Lawrence. But if you live in much of the rest of the state, Democrats don't win what you would, I'm sure, consider to be a fair share of elections. And so many Democrats believe it's in their interest to cross over and vote in the Republican primary for the more moderate Republican candidate. What this bill a couple of years ago, it prevented that. It prevented you from exercising what was at the time your right to change your party registration for a certain period of time so you could vote in a different primary. So that's one way that, at first blush you might say it's no big deal, but in many states, laws like that have been passed, and particularly in states where you have very close elections, they really can change the results of the elections. So registration is part of the equation, and of course the other half of the equation, if you will, is actually voting. And in more and more states, now it's actually very close to a majority of states, voter ID laws, or photo ID laws is really a more proper way to refer to it, have gone into effect. And that means that you have to have some sort of photographic picture identification when you go to the polls to vote. And if you don't, then in some states you're allowed to vote provisionally, and at some point after the election, in a very short period of time, you have to produce a photo ID for your vote actually to be counted. And in some other states, they don't even have that. If you show up and you don't have a photo ID, they don't allow you to vote. The rationale is that it prevents voter fraud. I suppose we'll find out in the next year or so. Yeah, we're all skeptical of this new commission. But what it's really going to do, and I guess I'm a glass half full type of person. When I was asked, and I've known Secretary Kubic literally for over 25 years, since he was in law school. He worked at my law firm when he was a law student, so I've known him for a long time. He should not be taken lightly. Let me tell you that. I mean, many of you in here probably think he's the devil incarnate. Whether he is or he isn't, he's awfully smart. He knows what he's doing. He knows the law. He takes advantage of the law. He is not to be trifled with. And I'll tell you, one thing to his credit, he will talk to anybody. If you invited him, he would come here and he would talk to you. I think that says something about him, that he is willing to talk to anybody about his issues, and he doesn't trim his message. He will say exactly what he believes. At least you know where he's coming from. All right, so where do we stand right now? In Kansas, you have to have a photo identification to vote. That is not an issue in any of the litigation up to now. What we, the ACLU, and by the way, I'm on the board of the Kansas ACLU, and one of the smartest things I've ever done was vote to hire this guy. But voter ID, photo ID, is not an issue in the litigation. It's only the proof of citizenship requirement in order to register. So in other words, the only thing that's involved in the lawsuits that Micah is involved in, ACLU is involved in, and that I'm involved in, has to do with registration. It doesn't have to do with actually voting. And maybe that's next. You take sort of a piece of the pie at a time. Candidly, I think photo ID is going to last. I think it's going to last. We would like to get rid of it, no question about it. It's not necessary. There's no evidence of fraud that justifies having it. But I think it's going to be a fact of life that we're going to have to deal with. It's the proof of citizenship requirement. It's the trimming registration times and what you have to do in order to register. That's where the fight is going to be in the next 3, 4, 5 years. And I think we're going to do well. Somebody says hand up.
Well, I have a question.
Am I supposed to?
Would you mind, we're going to go straight through and then come back around to questions?
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't want to take more
Yeah.
time than that, so.
Thanks, Mike. Mike, you get the first question, and then come back around. So, we all know that there are things to be very concerned about, obviously, that our first two speakers have told us, but I thought it would also be nice to have some positive news that perhaps our chief election officer.
The situation's much better than it was a year ago.
Exactly. The Kansas legislature may have made it somewhat easier to vote without going to the polls on election day. Jamie, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the absentee voting bill, HR 2158. Could you address that and anything else that you've been seeing or doing that we know that you're doing in Douglas County that does give people more access and ability to vote?
All right, I could do that. I like that. First of all, thank you for that introduction. That I owe you some money. Yes. So there's a couple things I want to touch on, and I'll get to that here in a second. One of the things, well, first of all, these guys are amazing. They are your warriors. They are your warriors in this fight, and so you should support them. But I know that they are not doing this because they're getting rich, right? They're doing this because they believe in this.
I'm not.
So a couple things I want to touch on is, Mark kind of mentioned that photo ID really isn't within the courts, and there's kind of a reason for that. And part of that is, on the photo ID portion, we have a pretty broad photo ID law. We are not as restrictive as many other states. And that was thanks to many of our legislators. When that law was being discussed, we realized we couldn't kill it, but we could at least put provisions in it which made it easier to administer. And so that is a huge part to our legislators. I mean, I've been helping my peers that run elections in Iowa who have been fighting. They just got a photo ID bill in Iowa. They were unable to do what we did. And so, for instance, in Iowa, they cannot use a college photo ID for their photo ID. And my peer in Iowa City, University of Iowa, that is a huge hit to him. The fact that our college students can use photo IDs from any state is a big deal. And then a big one for us was we were able to get in a thing that said any government-issued ID is acceptable. So I made my own photo ID. I'm a government, I can make an ID, right? So anybody in Douglas County can get a free ID. I will come to your home, I will take your photo, and we will give you an ID. So in my opinion, barriers may exist. I figure out how to build a ramp over them, right? And a shout out to the county commissioners. The other thing with the birth certificate was, I believe, the worst part of this law, the most inequitable part of this law, is that if you are not born in the state of Kansas, you have to go buy your birth certificate. Many of us weren't. We kind of landed in Kansas. And we looked at it, and it costs anywhere from $7 up to $75 to get a birth certificate. So the commissioners helped support my budget that we will pay for your birth certificate if you're a government. So while I can't change the law, I can at least work around it a little bit, right? So I think that's why photo ID in Kansas probably doesn't get what, like Tennessee or Texas and so forth. So that's the first part. I think the next part is this new legislature has been good to work with. And so there has been something we have worked on for a couple of years, which was to expand advanced voting in the ways that we administer it. And we haven't even been able to get a hearing in this year with 2 new chairs of elections committees, especially Senator Bowers in the Senate. They ran with it and we got it passed. Trust me, no one was more shocked than myself when the governor actually signed that thing. And the reason why is I can now accept any advance ballot that is in my office up to 3 days after Election Day, as long as it's postmarked on Election Day. And that's huge, because I used to get them on Wednesday and Thursday, and they didn't count. So we got that passed. You can now return your advanced ballot to any polling place, and it's not provisional. That is, so those are some changes that are made. Now, the one change that we made a compromise on, and from an administration standpoint, this is a good thing, but from a campaign standpoint, you need to be aware of. We moved the deadline to request a ballot to the Tuesday prior to the election instead of the Friday. And the reason for that is if you requested it on that Friday, there was no way you were getting that ballot by Tuesday. Under the new mail system, it just wasn't workable. So we made that compromise. So there are good things that have occurred. There are things that can be done to help work within these laws. But just know that for all those things that aren't great, you have some amazing people that are fighting these things. So
That's wonderful, but I would ask you, you're doing this in Douglas County, but that doesn't mean that these road overs are happening in other counties in Kansas. Is that
So
right?
I have some amazing peers across the state that are working really hard. There are some counties that are there are a couple counties that are offering the photo ID. They're not as vocal about it because they are of a different party. And they really want to do it, but they worry about backlash and so forth. You know, I live in a great community that was like, go for it. On both sides. And when I did the photo ID, I had both Republicans and Democrats in this county contact me and say that was a great thing. So there are counties that haven't done many of those things, but the really cool thing about elections in this country is local control. I mean, a lot of people don't realize we don't have a national election system. And one of the great things about our country is local control of elections. And so we are able to do that, at least in our county.
Thank you. So, it is 10:40. So at this point, we'd like to turn it over for questions to any of our panelists. And the first question goes to Mike.
Thank you. So after you get done slaying all these dragons, I have a humble request, and that is NVRA requires that public assistance agencies assist with voter registration. Now, I have a hunch that very few state public assistance agencies in Kansas are living up to that NVRA requirement. Not that it would be a boon to the Democratic Party, but I think it would be a boon to access to elections. And so my humble request is that after you get done with this biggie, that you take a look at that. I don't know if the ACLU is doing any work now. Is the ACLU doing anything? I know DEMOS is, but are you guys?
So the answer is yes, because it's not just a Kansas problem. There was a survey done a few years ago that, I forget the exact number now, but something like 65% of the states were not really making applications available in all of the places that they were submitting. It's not just assistance agencies, there's a bunch of agencies that are covered, that are funded by the government or operated by government that are supposed to make voter registration forms easily available. And the quick survey was that it just wasn't happening. And the population that was most disadvantaged, that had the least compliance level, was agencies that serve disabled populations. And so that was particularly concerning to us. And so it's something that we worked on both the voting rights side and in our disability rights project at National ACLU.
And is it that they just need to make the forms available, or do they need to provide assistance in completing the forms?
So they have to make the forms available. What assistance means is, I think, a much more interpretable item, and has been interpreted differently in different places. And that goes to Jamie's point about the lack of standardization and the lack of a sort of national election system, period. That plays into that. So
I think there's a couple of things. One of those is the National Voting Rights Act is now, was it 30 years old? It was
92.
Yeah. So I think a lot of it was put in place, and a lot of, especially election administrators, really haven't followed up with those, individuals. I think that's part of it. He touched on something that's huge that we talk about in our office. When you say fill out a form, that is a barrier for a lot of people. You hear Chris talk a lot about, well, it's no big deal because you can fill out these forms without these affidavits. that's a barrier for many citizens in our county just filling out a form. So I think that's the second part of it. But I just want to touch on NVRA for a second. This commission that was put in place, the whole reason, this is my opinion, is to rewrite NVRA. I have heard Chris on separate occasions talk about how he hates that NVRA doesn't allow us to remove people without going through a bunch of hurdles. The NVRA is the only thing that has saved many of these lawsuits. And so the thing to watch this commission is their attack on the NVRA in an attempt of this Congress to rewrite the National Voting Rights Act. And if it gets rewritten, that changes the ballgame.
Let me follow on what Jamie had to say about that. And that's that, I don't want to get into a constitutional lecture about this, but because of the fact that the United States is really unique in having a strong federal system, the states determine, with some exceptions, who gets to vote. And so what we think Secretary Kubic is attempting to do is have the federal legislation, such as the National Voter Rights Act, Voter Registration Act, rewritten to say that the states are under even less restrictions than they are today. And so I agree with Jamie that is, in all probability, the goal of this commission being set up. And that's largely also pointed out by the fact that they're only going to look at, and this is from the executive order, the voter fraud issue. They're not going to look at other things such as the changes in the registration laws, changes in photo ID laws that have resulted in the suppression of voting because of something that, again, Jamie referred to, these low hurdles. None of you in here is probably affected by these laws because you have computers, you can read forms, you can fill forms out, you all have driver's license probably, you have college IDs. The problem is that even with low hurdles, we lose people. How many people who don't have a computer, they have to go to the library to fill out the registration form. You lose people there. They won't go to the library. They get to the library, they look at the form online, and they say, my gosh, so complicated, forget it. So you lose 1% somewhere along the line. So with low hurdles, you add them all up, and we probably lose, my guess is 3 to 5% of the otherwise eligible voters. They just flat don't register. That's the real problem. That's what all of us together have to fix.
Following up to your statement there have been several laws, legislation proposed nationally to advance automatic registration. So instead of having to opt in, you got to opt out. What are the chances of this in various places, and is there a chance, and you know where, for this to happen in Kansas? Anybody?
Well, you talked about the positive part. If you want to talk true election reform, election day registration, automatic registration, mail ballots, provisional legislation, those things are happening in other states. We talk about the states where it's restrictive, but Colorado all mail ballot, Iowa, Minnesota, where you can register on election day. If we could just do election day registration in Kansas, would remove 90% of our provisionals.
Is there the political will for that?
There is not at this moment. But I will tell you, there is a little bit within the legislature, but I don't know if automatic registration, but if we could at least get election day registration, that would solve a ton and kind of remove some of those barriers for some of that.
So we at the ACLU strongly support election day voter registration, right? It makes things a lot easier, and more importantly, it really boosts turnout. So every state that has election day voter registration, you see 11 and 12% point increases in voter turnout right off the bat. and then it's sustained. You see those states are ones that have higher levels of civic engagement, where people know more about what is going on in their community, they donate more to charity, there's higher social capital. The reason for that is, with no disrespect to politicians and campaigns, but if you don't know who the electorate is, because anyone can show up and vote, you have to do a much more robust job of trying to engage everyone and trying to appeal to everyone, not just the folks who are on the rolls 1 month out. And so as a result, the society as a whole becomes stronger. We at the ACLU are not super enthusiastic right now about automated voter registration or automatic voter registration. And that's for the simple reason that we don't think most government systems are sophisticated enough or technologically proficient enough right now to make it work and not cause additional problems. We'd love for the burden to be on the government rather than on the individual to register to vote. But you have to keep in mind, the places that have tried this so far, they've like ported over driver's license records. Well, you don't actually have to be a citizen to get a driver's license. You can be here on a green card. You can get a driver's license and have been a felon. But in many states, you will be at least temporarily disenfranchised if you had a felony, right? So there are huge numbers of people who might mistakenly, inadvertently get registered to vote because the government automates the system. They didn't take the action. They wind up on the voter registration roll. And then there's this guy who likes to go around prosecuting people for voter fraud. And so you get people who are going to get hung up for things that they themselves did not actually participate in. Right? So until the systems are sophisticated enough to handle that, we're really reluctant to endorse it. In the meantime, we are launching a campaign over the summer to really push for election day voter registration. We think there may be an opportunity to do it because there are a bunch of places that have, including states like Utah and Idaho, right? These are not crazy commie liberal pinko states, right? These are states where people see that it boosts turnout across the spectrum. All parties, all ideologies, everybody shows up more. Or you could even do like that noted hotbed of radicalism, North Dakota, that doesn't have a voter registration roll at all. There's not voter registration in North Dakota. You just show up at the polls, show that you live in North Dakota, and you get to vote. They don't make you register at all. There's no arbitrary bureaucracy. And as a result, they have one of the highest turnout rates in the country.
One of the questions was, should we be suspicious about voting machine tampering?
No.
I like that.
That is a canard. It doesn't exist. Period.
What are the ramifications, if any? What are the ramifications, if any, of the lack of funding for the Census Bureau?
Well, that is something that we all need to be thinking about now. The census, you say, well, it's 3 years away. Who cares? The director of the census resigned this week. There is no head of the census. It's in the Commerce Department. And of course, as many of you know, under the Constitution, we have to do the census every 2 years. So it's a constitutional requirement. And what directly affects us as a result of the census is every state learns how many people it has, and Congress then allocates the number of congressional seats, set at 435, among the states. Some states win, some states, but some states get more seats, some states have seats taken away. That's Congress. And then within the states themselves, the district lines for state Senate and state House seats are redrawn. Kansas, by its state constitution, has 40 state senators and 125 state representatives. No more, no less. What the census is going to do is tell us where those seats have to be assigned. I represented Johnson County in the litigation in 2012 arising out of the failure of the legislature to redraw the lines. And Senator Ballard had nothing to do with that. I mean, well, it was not her fault. That's what I meant. That's what I should have said. It was Republicans who couldn't decide what to do. And the population of the state is, I'm sure, with the next census, going to be shown to be more eastern concentrated, if you will. Johnson County, probably by then, will have up to 25% of the state's population. What we all have to be thinking about right now is how these lines are going to be redrawn. Some states have adopted impartial commissions to do that. The Supreme Court recently upheld that, the constitutionality of doing that in the case involving Arizona. Kansas doesn't have that. Kansas is still done on a very much partisan basis. If the majorities in the state House and the state Senate can agree on lines, and essentially the practice was the state House would draw its lines, the state Senate would draw its lines, and each House would defer to the other. In 2011, that didn't happen. The Republicans couldn't agree among themselves, and so that's why we ended up in court. I doubt, the Republicans probably think that because of their failure to agree that the lines aren't as favorable to them as they otherwise would have been because 3 federal judges drew the lines. So maybe in 2021, they will do their jobs. What, from your party's point of view, what this means is that you have to pay attention to this. You have to plan. You have to be thinking about it now. You have to have a strategy. So 3 or 4 years from now, when this process is underway, where the lines are being redrawn, you don't say to yourselves, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Didn't anybody think about this? You need to be thinking about this. Tell your legislators, let's get something done. Let's have a plan. And the state party as well.
Here's the really quick scary part. I just got back from a national meeting of elections officials. Beyond that, your precincts are based on the census block.
That's right.
I can't build a precinct that goes outside of the census block. The fundamental basis of the entire election system is based off the census block. And the fear across the country is if not just the census count goes wrong, but the whole census block mapping system isn't right, it puts everything off. So it's not just the count, it is the mapping and the blocks that really concern those of us around election.
So what should we do?
So what? Well, okay.
2018 numbers.
Okay, yeah, well, let me just tell you what can happen if you don't do something. This is something that came out when I was looking at the maps that the legislature had attempted to draw in 2011. Remember, I was representing Johnson County, basically 20% of the state's population at that point. One of the Senate maps drawn by the Republicans, I looked at it very carefully and I said, whoa. Now, Olathe is the county seat of Johnson County. It is in the heart of the county, geographic center of the county. They had drawn the lines in such a way that a state Senate district that encompassed actually most of Douglas County would sort of have an arrow right into the heart of Johnson County and pick up Olathe. So Olathe, where the county seat is, where the jail is, where the administrative center of the county would be represented by somebody from Douglas County. That didn't seem right, and the judges agreed. So that's the kind of stuff that can happen. What was the question? What can we be doing?
What can we do?
What do we do?
To plan and strategize?
Well, the first thing is, and again, I'm not urging this on a partisan basis. I'm not here as a partisan. You need to have as many elected officials in the State House and the State Senate as possible who support your point of view. In other words, the 2018 election is very important. Did I say 2018? Right. The 2018 election is very important. 2020 will be even more important, I suppose. But 2018 is important because that's when they're going to, in essence, start writing the rules that are going to be used to reapportion all of the House and Senate seats in Kansas.
And push for for our legislators to push for the removal of the crazy Kansas law that removes, at the local redistricting, removes all the college students and military out of our county and put them in their home county. So we are the only state that does that. So the federal redistricting is different than state redistricting. So because of that, we have legislators who represent 10,000 more people than is on the books because we remove them from here to their home county. That's a huge one for us to try it. Now, the chance of doing that's really hard because everybody likes having them come back to their home county. But
It's in the Constitution, so
yes, it's a constitutional part. But
Yeah,
we can
and
get it.
there's also, and the military population figures into that as
Yeah.
well.
So anyway,
I'm going to give you one more really, I hope, quick question and then one last question because we're winding up. Who pays for Kobach's defense in ACLU cases?
So this is a little different than some other cases that involve the state. You know, like when there's a unconstitutional abortion restriction, for example, the state legislature or the attorney general or the governor hire an outside law firm usually to defend the state. That's what they're doing in the school financing stuff, for example. Now, with Secretary Kubik, he represents himself. So he is both the defendant and the lawyer. And for reasons that are completely unfathomable to me, the Attorney General of the state has allowed that and has not intervened. And so, you know, usually it is the job of the Attorney General to represent the state and defend its laws. For whatever reason, the Attorney General in the state has allowed, in this particular set of issues, to allow Secretary Kubik to defend himself. The virtue of that, I suppose, is that it does reduce costs to the taxpayers. So you're not paying an outside law firm. But you know what they say about a defendant who is his own lawyer.
so it hasn't really been talked about, but the Help America Vote Act gave money to the states to help with funding of equipment and so forth. Secretary of State Ron Thornburg, who I have a lot of respect for, he had set up a fund that would go on for about 20 years to help the counties pay for things like our access to the state voter registration system, to get our new equipment and so forth. Secretary Kubik has used HAVA funds to pay for things like voter ID campaigns, citizenship campaigns, and he's depleted the HAVA money. There is no longer any HAVA money. So now our county is paying, we used to pay about $6,000 for access to the state voter system. It's now about 30-some thousand because there's no more HAVA money. So it does have an impact, even though he likes to brag about he's doing this all for free while he's sitting in a duck blind, that type of thing. It is having an impact on his office's ability to support the county.
Well, and let me just say one thing there. To say it's not costing the state money is ridiculous. Because even though he is defending himself, he has had to beef up the number of lawyers in the Secretary of State's office. There is one lawyer working full-time on these cases. And that's not the secretary. He has a junior lawyer working full-time on that. My guess is that person, he probably made $60,000, $70,000 a year. The secretary, the time he devotes to these cases, if I were to guess, he's probably spending about a third of his time working on these cases. I know how much I charge per hour. And Chris and I are, I'm 61, Chris is 10 years younger than I'm 51. If you just did the math, number of hours times what they would pay for an outside lawyer, I mean, the state is probably spending between anywhere from $100,000 to $300,000 a year defending these cases because that's how much they're paying the people who are actually doing the work. So it is costing money. And then I just learned something I didn't know before about this is how the HAVA funds are being used. And that's a law that it was put into place after the 2000 election debacle in order to modernize the processes that we're supposed to be using in our election system.
Okay, one more quick thing to end the discussion. You know, you're talking to a room full of activists here that are engaged and want to help and want to support voting rights. So what advice would you give this room as to what can we do? Well, how can we leave this room and aid your mission?
So I think there are two things that we need to do. We need to repeal the existing restrictions that are on the books, and the way we do that is by encouraging our elected officials to do so. I think you here in Douglas County have the virtue of having state legislators who are already on board with that, but there are 125 legislators in the House and 40 in the Senate, and we got to get more of them, and that means we got to contact other folks and have them contact their elected officials as well to get rid of the restrictions. And then the second thing we need to do is be putting that pressure on, mobilizing in favor of Election Day voter registration. Because I, for one, am tired, sick and tired of talking about restrictions on the ballot. I'm tired of always having to talk about why something is bad. I want to talk about why something is good. I want to talk about how we can expand the franchise. I want to talk about how we can get citizens more engaged and not always be talking about why Chris Kobach's ideas are terrible. They are, we all agree. Let's figure out what we can do in the meantime to actually proactively expand the franchise even while we fight the rearguard action. So mobilize in favor of Election Day registration.
I agree with everything that Micah said, but I'm going to be a little more realistic. The chances, it's a fight worth fighting to change the law. The chances of changing the law in any significant way in the next couple of years are pretty slim. What I would suggest is, deal with the law as we have it today. Proof of citizenship may go out the window in the next year or so, we're hoping. Photo ID will be with us, at least for the foreseeable future. I would do whatever you can to encourage the state party to go to places where the population, from sort of a percentage point of view, doesn't have photo ID, and get that. That's the first point. The second point, I believe, would be, again, at the state party level. Do whatever you can to encourage the state party to ramp up its registration, its voter registration efforts. Because I think in the short run, and by that I mean 2 to 3 years or so, those are going to be the most effective ways to increase what I assume to be the number of voters that we want to have.
Thank you. James?
Most of you have heard me say it. This past summer I did a bunch of speeches. We are at a point where we're discussing whether voting is a right or a privilege. And I thought that was decided in the 1960s, but evidently we're still deciding it. And we are on the slippery slope of making it a privilege again. And when it's a privilege, that means people like myself decide who gets to vote. And I don't want that responsibility. And so the biggest things are to fight to retain it as a right. I mean, you've heard me say we declared ourselves a constitutional carry state a couple years ago, so now you're going to be able to carry in the courthouse and so on and so forth. Why don't we declare ourselves a constitutional vote state? Where no right should, there should be no right that impinges that, right? So, I'm with Micah that we spend a lot of time talking about, and kind of bemoaning the fact that, we have all these rules. How do we get over them? But Election Day registration is a huge one. Work with the League of Women Voters is going to push that law next year. So work with the League of Women Voters, support the ACLU in their fight, but really push for those things. I have said to legislators when I testify, if you want to talk about reform, let's talk about reform. Reform that truly changes voter registration is Election Day registration. Mail ballot elections is a huge part for Western Kansas. Push for those things, and then the other thing is don't let the thing stop you. Register people to vote, and then get them their citizenship. So if somebody says, I don't have citizenship, our office will get them citizenship. If they say, I don't have photo ID, our office will get them photo ID. Don't let I don't have be the reason why somebody doesn't vote. So be acting in those two ways, which is jumping over the barriers and then passing laws that help provide access to the ballot. Those are the two things you can do.
All right. Everybody will join with me in thanking our panel. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your continued work, and thank all of you.